you ever stopped to think that some popular legends might be more than just stories told around a campfire? Among all the creatures of Brazilian folklore, the werewolf holds a special place, not just for the fear it inspires, but for the number of accounts that persist to this day. We're not talking about children's tales or horror movies, but something more disturbing. Real testimonies, unexplainable marks, and nights interrupted by howls that seem to come from nowhere. The legend, of course, wasn't born here. It arrived with the Portuguese colonizers, laden with European superstitions. But by mixing with indigenous and African traditions, it gained unique contours. In Brazil, the werewolf stopped being just a cursed man to become something more symbolic, a dark guardian of the borders between the natural and the supernatural world. And if you think this is just another superstition forgotten by time, wait until you hear the recent accounts, coming from small towns where modernity hasn't erased the fear of full moon nights. Imagine living in a rural community where the streets empty as soon as the sun sets. The dogs, normally alert, become restless, and a strange silence settles in. Suddenly, a howl cuts through the air, not like that of a wolf or dog, but something deeper, almost human. It's at that moment that doubt sets in. Would you open the door to see what's out there? Or would you pray for the day to dawn without further incidents? For many Brazilians, this isn't a hypothetical question. It's a real precaution, passed down from generation to generation. And the most unsettling thing is that the accounts aren't limited to the past. In Itabaiana, Sergipe, in 2008, residents claim to have seen a furry, red-eyed creature wandering the streets. In São Luís do Paraitinga, São Paulo, farmers found attacked herds, with bite marks that didn't correspond to any known predator. Even in the peripheries of large cities, there are those who swear they've seen something beyond human comprehension. Coincidence, illusion, or proof that some legends refuse to die. Throughout this story, you'll see how a European myth transformed into one of the scariest tales in Brazilian folklore. But more than that, you'll understand why, even in a world dominated by science and technology, the fear of the werewolf still persists. In the end, you'll decide for yourself. Is it just folklore? Or is there something more lurking in the shadows of Brazilian nights? The werewolf legend wasn't born in Brazil, but was imported from medieval Europe, especially from Portugal, France, and Germany. In those cold lands, full of superstitions, it was believed that the curse fell upon those who sinned gravely or who were born under specific conditions. Among these beliefs, the most common was that the seventh son of a family, born after 6 consecutive daughters, would be doomed to transform into a beast on full moon nights. It was a clear warning. Even the family structure could carry a dark weight. In Portugal, for example, the werewolf was seen as a sinner who, for his crimes or impure lineage, suffered this condemnation. During the day, he was an ordinary man, although pale, thin, with an empty look and a withdrawn posture. Mothers feared having a 7th son, and many resorted to religious practices to ward off the curse. Special baptism, with a priest's blessing, was one of the most popular methods to break the cycle before it even manifested. The European villages, shrouded in mist and silence, were the perfect setting for fear to take root. On full moon nights, residents locked doors and windows, while praying not to hear the howl that cut through the silence. This belief wasn't seen just as superstition, but as a warning. Any man could carry a dormant monster inside him, and worse, he might not even know it until the full moon revealed his true nature. When the Portuguese colonizers arrived in Brazil in the 16th century, they brought with them not only their clothes, their tools, and their faith, but also their horror stories. The werewolf legend found fertile ground in rural communities, where the isolation and darkness of tropical nights made the myth even scarier. The 7th son began to be seen as a warning sign, leading many families to baptize their sons in haste or even avoid having large families. The most interesting thing is how this legend has spanned centuries, changing shape but never losing its essence. In Brazilian lands, the werewolf stopped being just a family curse and became a dark guardian of the forests, deserted roads, and silent nights. But, like any imported legend, it would gain new contours as it mixed with the local culture, creating something unique and even more unsettling. When the werewolf legend arrived in Brazil, it didn't just find a new territory, but a fertile cultural environment, full of indigenous and African myths. The native peoples already told stories about shape-shifting beings, like the Jurupari, a spirit that roamed the forests in different forms, often to punish those who disrespected nature. This figure, dark and implacable, soon merged with the image of the European werewolf, creating something unique, a creature that not only attacked, but also protected sacred territories. African traditions, in turn, brought supernatural entities that assumed animal forms as a manifestation of power or revenge. In Yoruba culture, for example, there were stories of sorcerers who could transform into animals to watch or attack their enemies. This influence helped shape the image of the Brazilian werewolf as something more than cursed, a dark guardian, a force of nature that punished the unjust and protected the invisible borders of the forests and villages. In the rural communities of the Northeast and Southeast, the werewolf came to be seen as a family curse, yes, but also as a presence that watched over the nights. In small towns, it was common to hear accounts of people who said they had seen a furry figure crossing deserted roads or prowling around corrals. On isolated farms, residents reinforced doors and windows on full moon nights, not just out of fear, but out of respect for the traditions that claimed, where there is too much silence, there may be something more. A curious detail is that, in Brazil, the werewolf wasn't restricted to forests or villages. In some inland cities, it was even associated with urban environments in the peripheries. Reports of unusual footprints on vacant lots, incessant barking of dogs during the early morning, and distant howls reinforced the belief that the creature could wander beyond the forests, adapting to the human environment, as if the legend also evolved with time. Thus, the Brazilian werewolf ceased to be just a reflection of European beliefs and became a national folklore icon. Mixing Portuguese superstition with indigenous and African myths, it gained a new meaning. Not just a cursed creature, but a symbol of the unfathomable mysteries of Brazilian nights. And it is precisely on those nights, under the cold light of the full moon, that the transformation becomes more than a legend. It becomes a palpable fear. The transformation into a werewolf, according to popular tradition, is neither instant nor silent. It begins with a subtle discomfort, as if the body were out of tune. The cursed one feels a growing heat running through each muscle, followed by excruciating pain in the bones, as if each joint were rearranging itself. The heart races, the skin hardens, the hairs grow rapidly, and the nails lengthen, sharp as blades. At that moment, human consciousness dissipates, giving way to primal instinct. The eyes, once ordinary, gain an intense glow, sometimes yellowish, sometimes reddish, reflecting the fury contained by the curse. During this process, the man ceases to recognize his own identity, being dominated by an uncontrollable impulse. It's as if the creature were always lurking, waiting for the exact moment to emerge. In many regions of Brazil, it is believed that the transformation occurs preferably on Thursday to Friday nights, when lunar energy reaches its peak. After the metamorphosis, the werewolf follows an almost ritualistic path. Legend has it that he travels through 7 villages, 7 cemeteries, or 7 crossroads, a symbolic cycle that represents the dominance of darkness over the territory. In each place, he leaves traces, footprints larger than those of any dog, broken branches, and, in some cases, dead animals with deep bite marks. Whoever hears the distant howl must lock doors and windows, as it is a sign that the creature is near. Some say that looking directly into the eyes of a werewolf can be fatal, or worse, can transmit the curse. Therefore, the advice has always been clear. If you hear a howl cutting through the night, pray and don't leave home. Many rural families kept amulets, such as crucifixes and rue branches, believing that these protections could ward off the creature. But the truth is that, once transformed, the werewolf is guided by something beyond the reach of prayers: the insatiable hunger and the need to fulfill his nightly cycle. When the sun finally dawns on the horizon, the transformation unravels, and the man returns to his original form, exhausted, covered in sweat, and often without memory of what he did during the night. But the traces remain: footprints in the mud, dead chickens in the yard, incessant barking of dogs. And, for those who carry the curse, each dawn brings temporary relief, because, on the next full moon, everything starts again, as if the cycle could never be truly broken. The werewolf legend has transcended folklore and intertwined with reality through countless accounts, mainly in small towns in the interior of Brazil. In Itabaiana, Sergipe, in the year 2008, residents claim to have seen a furry, red-eyed creature prowling the streets during the early morning. The dogs barked non-stop, chickens were found dead with unusual bite marks, and large footprints appeared on the dirt floor. The case was reported by local radio stations, fueling fear among the inhabitants. In São Luís do Paratinga, São Paulo, in the 1970s, a wave of attacks on herds was attributed to an alleged werewolf. Farmers reported that, at dawn, they found sheep with their necks torn and giant footprints in the mud, incompatible with any known animal. A curious detail: the attacks always happened on full moon nights, and the dogs in the region, normally vigilant, remained cowering, as if they felt something beyond human comprehension. An even more famous case occurred in Ouro Preto, Minas Gerais, where a man claimed to have been attacked by a creature on a rural road. According to him, the beast jumped out of the shadows, knocking him to the ground. The man fought as best he could, but woke up hours later with deep cuts on his arm and a high fever. No medical examination could explain the origin of the wounds or the fever. The story spread quickly, and residents began to avoid that road after sunset. In the interior of Bahia, in 2019, farmers in the localities of Campinas and Guapira reported appearances of an unidentified animal wandering through the fields. The descriptions were always similar: a tall being with dark fur, an elongated snout and bright eyes. The security cameras of the farms even captured shadows, but the images were blurred, as if the creature itself knew how to avoid complete exposure. The fear was so great that, for a time, residents organized nightly patrols to protect the cattle. The most intriguing thing about these accounts is not only the similarity between them, but the emotional impact on the witnesses. Many claimed to feel an intense cold before spotting the creature, as if the werewolf's very presence altered the environment around it. Even today, in the rural regions of Brazil, those who live far from the lights of the cities know the advice well. If you hear a distant howl, don't look out the window. Pray and wait for the day to be born, because, true or not, the fear is real, and often that's enough to keep the legend alive. Even with technological advances and modern skepticism, the werewolf legend remains alive, especially in the rural regions of Brazil. In small towns, you can still hear stories told by grandparents on full moon nights. In these communities, the werewolf is not just a myth, but a warning about the dangers of the night. Those who live in the countryside know, if the dogs get restless and the silence seems denser than normal, it's better not to risk it, because, for many, the werewolf is not a superstition. It's a real presence. Among the elders, there is the belief that the curse can be broken. One of the best-known ways is to wound the creature, making it bleed. They say that, at dawn, the injured man will appear hurt in the same place where the beast was wounded. Another way would be to baptize the seventh son in a special ceremony, under the blessing of a priest. Many families, fearing the curse, have adopted this practice for generations, as a spiritual insurance against the unknown. For some, the werewolf is more than a creature of terror. It has become a symbol of the fear of the unknown. On the dark nights of the most remote regions, the distant howl is enough to keep doors locked and lights off. In villages like Guarani, in Minas Gerais, There are those who say that, even today, unusual footprints appear after full moon dawns, leading many to avoid leaving home on those days. And it's not just the residents of the interior who keep this belief alive. In online forums such as Reddit and folklore communities on Facebook, contemporary accounts continue to appear. People who swear they've seen something on deserted roads, heard unexplainable howls, or felt a presence watching from afar. Science, of course, attributes these accounts to imagination or common animals seen under stress. But how to explain the footprints, the unexplainable attacks on herds, and the marks on human bodies? Perhaps the truth will never be fully revealed. For those who live in big cities, the werewolf is just a tale to scare children. But for those who know the dark nights of rural roads or have heard a howl cutting through the absolute silence, the doubt remains. As an old popular saying goes, whoever doesn't believe is because they've never heard the howl up close. And in that case, maybe it's better to continue without hearing it. Now that you've explored the legend of the werewolf in Brazil in depth, the question remains, are we dealing with just a folk tale or something that truly transcends the boundaries of imagination? After all, when residents from different parts of the country, separated by centuries of history, describe the same creature with glowing eyes, an elongated snout, and a piercing howl, it's hard to completely dismiss the possibility that there's something more to it. Perhaps the werewolf isn't just a physical creature, but the personification of our most primal fears, the unknown, the night, and vulnerability. But here's the most curious detail. The legend persists precisely because it can't be completely disproven. The giant footprints in the mud, the inexplicable attacks on livestock, the accounts of people who wake up with scratches without knowing where they came from. All of this fuels the myth, creating a cycle in which folklore and reality blend together. Anyone who lives in the countryside knows this well. No matter how skeptical you are, when you hear a distant howl on a full moon night, the last thing you want to do is go out to investigate. And you, after everything you've seen and heard, do you still believe that the werewolf is just a story to scare children? Or is it possible that, somewhere in the dark woods, something really walks among us on the nights when the moon dominates the sky? Share your opinion in the comments. Have you ever heard a similar account? Do you know someone who swears they've seen something inexplicable? But if you thought all of that was scary, wait until you hear the next story. A real story, told by someone who lived through what only seemed possible in nightmares. Stick around if you dare. The village of San Bento has always been a place forgotten by time, surrounded by mountains and dense forests that seemed to whisper secrets as night fell. The dirt roads became deserted as soon as the sun went down, and the faint lights of the houses looked more like flickering flames trying to ward off the darkness. Among the residents, old stories circulated like veiled warnings, passed down from generation to generation, but always regarded as folklore. Miss Mary, an old woman with skin wrinkled like tree bark and eyes grayed by time, was the guardian of these memories. Sitting in her rocking chair, she warned the children, "Never underestimate the seventh full moon." I honestly always thought these stories were an exaggeration. I grew up listening to the old folks talk about nights when the wind carried strange howls, about impossible footprints found on the riverbanks. But deep down, they were just tales to scare the young ones and keep them away from the woods after nightfall. Until one October night, the seventh full moon appeared in the sky, round and pale like a watchful eye. No one paid much attention until the first footprints appeared near Mr. Francisco's corral. They were too big for a dog, but shaped differently from any other known animal. Miss Mary was the first to notice. The next morning, while looking for firewood behind her house, she found broken branches, the ground turned over, and a strange smell in the air, something between burnt meat and wet earth. She hurried back, muttering, "The cycle has begun again." The elders understood immediately. Doors began to be locked earlier, and the dogs, normally calm, snarled at nothing. It was as if the entire village had held its breath, waiting for something that no one really wanted to see. That same night, the silence was broken by a long, guttural howl coming from the hills to the north. It wasn't the sound of a wolf. There hadn't been wolves in that region for decades. The sound reverberated between the houses, making the windows vibrate. The residents looked at each other, pale, and ran inside, turning off the lights. I remember standing on the porch, my heart pounding in my chest, as my mother pulled my arm. "Get inside, boy! That's not of God." Shortly after the howl, I heard heavy footsteps in the alley next to the house. It wasn't the light trot of a horse, nor the rhythmic walk of a person. They were irregular strides, as if something large but injured was dragging one of its paws. I peeked through the crack in the window, holding my breath. The faint light of the lamppost revealed a tall, hunched silhouette with shoulders too broad to be human. The sound of claws scratching the dirt floor echoed, and I recoiled, tripping over the chair behind me. The next day, the conversation at the store was the same. Something was prowling around the houses. Mr. Francisco, a man with suntanned skin and a grizzled beard, said he had found his chickens dead, with bite marks on their necks. No animal kills like that, not even a jaguar. The old village priest, always skeptical, suggested they were wild dogs, but no one believed him. Miss Mary's eyes, always attentive, seemed to see beyond the words. She just muttered, "The seventh sun, the seventh moon." The following night was even more unsettling. The dogs, which used to bark at any movement, were now silent, tails between their legs and eyes wide. The wind brought with it a smell of iron blood, perhaps, and from time to time the crackling of breaking branches came from the woods. Even those who didn't believe in the legends closed their windows and kept the lights off. It was as if the entire village had gone back in time, to an era when creatures of the shadows still dominated the nights. Around 2 in the morning, I heard those footsteps again, now closer. The wood of the porch creaked under the weight of something that didn't dare to be seen. I took a deep breath, gathering the courage to peek through the curtains. What I saw chilled me to the bone. Fresh, huge footprints marking the damp earth right in front of my door. The creature wasn't just wandering through the woods. It was prowling around the houses. At dawn, everyone came out of their houses, tired, eyes red from spending the night awake. The footprints led towards the corral again, but disappeared abruptly near a small stream, as if the creature had evaporated in the morning mist. Mr. Francisco shook his head, somber. "This isn't over, not with that moon in the sky." The elders gathered in the town square at dusk, discussing what to do. Some suggested armed vigils. Others wanted to call for reinforcements from the neighboring town. But Miss Mary, with her wise gaze, just watched the horizon. "Don't you understand yet? This isn't just any animal. It's a warning." And it was that night that something even more disturbing happened, leading everyone to question whether they were really just dealing with a legend. The sun had barely risen when the first murmurs began to spread through the village. Mr. Francisco was the first to notice. His chickens were dead, scattered across the floor of the henhouse, with deep marks on their necks and bellies. It wasn't the work of a common predator. The footprints around, large but with an unusual shape, seemed to disappear in the middle of the trail leading to the river. He called the neighbors, and soon the small dirt road was filled with people whispering, uneasy. Miss Mary, always observant, arrived with her faded shawl and wide eyes. "This is just the beginning," she murmured, as she analyzed the footprints with a knowing look. No one dared to contradict her. The elders began to reinforce the doors with wooden planks, while the mothers called the children inside. Even the priest, normally skeptical, seemed bothered. He suggested they were wild wolves, but everyone knew that wolves hadn't roamed that region for decades. That same afternoon, Joao, a thin boy with brown eyes and dark hair, decided to follow the footprints. He had always mocked the legends, believing they were stories created to control children. With a machete on his waist and his cell phone in his hand, he walked the trail that passed through Mr. Francisco's corral and continued into the dense woods. With each step, the silence became denser, as if the forest was holding its breath. That's when he found the broken branches and dark stains on the ground, still damp. The smell of iron was strong, almost suffocating. João bent down to examine it better and felt a chill run down his spine. Something was very wrong there. He turned around, but when he looked back, he saw the same footprints he had followed. Only now they were superimposed on his own marks, as if something had followed him step by step. Back in the village, João told what he saw, but many believed it was just another youthful exaggeration. Until, as night fell, absolute silence took over the streets. Not even the crickets chirped. And then, from deep in the woods, came the sound that froze everyone's blood. A long, deep howl, filled with a pain that seemed almost human. The doors closed, the lights went out, and the entire village held its breath, waiting for the worst. The third night brought with it a different silence, denser, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The lamps in the houses were already extinguished before 9, and even the crickets ceased their song. It was then that, from the top of the hill, echoed a long, deep howl that seemed to tear the sky. It wasn't just a sound, it was a warning, something that hit the bones and made the heart beat faster. I was on the porch, holding the cup of cold coffee, when the sound paralyzed me. The dogs began to bark desperately, as if they had seen something they couldn't face. The doors of the houses closed in an almost rehearsed synchronism, and the lights, one by one, went out. It was at this moment that João, the most skeptical young man in the village, decided to act. "It's just an animal, nothing more," he said, grabbing his cell phone and a flashlight before disappearing down the dirt road that led to the river. Time passed slowly. 15 minutes. 20. Half an hour. No one dared to leave the house to look for João. The shadows danced on the walls as the moon moved in the sky, and the wind brought with it the metallic smell of blood. When the branches cracked in the nearby woods, I knew something was wrong. I looked out the window and saw João coming back, running, pale as a ghost. He stumbled into the house, sweaty and breathless. I saw the eyes," he stammered, holding the trembling cell phone. On the screen, a shaky video showed something impossible. Between the trees, 2 yellow eyes shone, fixed on the camera. A huge blur passed running in the background, too fast to be identified. The sound of the howl ended the recording, followed by sepulchral silence. The houses remained locked for the rest of the night, while the elders prayed softly. No one slept. The howl echoed 3 more times, each time closer, until dawn brought some relief. But the feeling that something was lurking remained, as if the shadows now had a life of their own, watching, waiting for the right moment to attack. When the sun set again, the men of the village decided to act. Armed with flashlights, machetes, and rusty shotguns, they formed a group to patrol the surroundings. João, still shaken, insisted on going along. "If we don't face this, we'll never sleep in peace again," he said with a firm look, although his fingers trembled as he held the flashlight. The forest, normally vibrant with nocturnal sounds, was strangely quiet. The group advanced slowly, illuminating each bush, each twisted branch. That's when they found the first marks. Trees scratched to the height of a man and dark stains on the ground. The smell of iron returned, stronger than ever, as if the ground itself was bleeding. Suddenly, a muffled scream cut through the air. One of the hunters, who had moved away to check a side trail, disappeared. His flashlight flickered on the ground, illuminating only the crushed foliage. "Come back, now!" shouted the leader of the group, but it was too late. The sound of branches breaking echoed around, as if something large was circling the team. Panic set in. The men retreated towards the village, but the way was blocked. Under the cold light of the full moon, the creature finally appeared. Tall, muscular, with dark fur and bright eyes, it growled, revealing long, sharp fangs. For an instant, no one moved. Time seemed frozen, as if the forest itself was watching the inevitable outcome. It was Joao who broke the trance, throwing a stone at the creature before running. The werewolf advanced, agile as a living shadow. The shots echoed, but none seemed to hit. When they finally reached the dirt road that led to the village, the final howl echoed behind them, not of pain but of triumph. The beast wasn't fleeing. It was hunting. Dawn brought an unsettling silence. The streets were empty, and the doors of the houses remained locked. The group returned in silence, exhausted and dejected. Joao, with his shirt torn and a deep cut on his arm, walked slowly, as if carrying an invisible weight. No one spoke about what they saw in the forest, but everyone's eyes reflected the same truth. The legend wasn't just folklore. Miss Mary was the first to leave the house, bringing herbs and cloths to care for the wounded. She looked at Joao with sadness and said, "You have been touched by the cursed boy. Now it knows you." He tried to laugh, but the sound came out hoarse, broken by fear. The cut on his arm wouldn't stop bleeding, despite all efforts to stop it. That night, the village kept vigil. No one dared to sleep. The lamps remained lit until dawn, but, curiously, the howl didn't come. Instead, soft, almost human footsteps were heard around the houses, as if someone or something was checking each door, each window. When the sun finally illuminated the dirt streets, Joao had disappeared. His footprints led to the edge of the forest, where they suddenly vanished, as if he had evaporated into the air. In the place where he was last seen, there was only a small trace of blood and, next to it, huge footprints that ended abruptly. Since then, the nights of the full moon have never been the same in San Bento. The elders continue to tell the story as a warning, and the children learn early on, never ignore the seventh moon, because when it appears in the sky, something awakens, something that is never too far from the shadows. You may even think that all this is just folklore, exaggerated stories to scare children or entertain around the campfires. But those who live in villages like San Bento know that certain things cannot be explained with logic alone. The sudden silence of the forest, footprints that begin and end without explanation, the sudden cold under the light of the full moon. These are signs that many prefer to ignore until it's too late. So, would you open the door if you heard footsteps on the porch at night? Would you have the courage to follow a distant howl, as Joao did, believing it was just a lost animal? Or would you stay locked in the house, praying that it would pass without taking anyone else? The truth is that, when the unknown knocks on your door, fear is no longer just a story. If you like this story and want to hear more stories like this, real or born from the shadows of legends, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share with those who think they are not afraid of the supernatural. But be careful. The next story may be even more disturbing. If you have the courage, stay here, because when night falls, what is in the shadows may be closer than you imagine.